Obscure plasma swords as featured in Halo. Do they make sense? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So we're going to be looking at a specific weapon featured in the franchise Halo. And specifically we're going to be asking, does the weapon make sense? Does it have any historical counterparts that we can use for evidence of this? Now this is thanks to one of my followers who is called Galen Lake. Galen, thank you very much for your message. It's great to receive messages from people who watch the channel. Now usually obviously I deal with historical weapons, replicas thereof, historical accounts, all that kind of stuff, martial arts and so on and so forth. But occasionally I like to have a foray, a tangent into the world of fantasy or gaming or sci-fi. So here we go. Let's have a look at a specific weapon as featured in Halo. And specifically today we're going to be looking at the plasma sword as used by the Sangheili with their specific design of hand, which we'll look at in a minute. And this is known as the Type 1 energy weapon sword and is one of the Covenant weapons. But very briefly before we dive into that, let's have a quick word from our amazing sponsors for this video, who are Mobiglobes. It was brilliant offer down below. Now I love Mobiglobes. I've actually had one for quite a while and they make absolutely awesome presents. If you're wondering how they work, they seem to magically rotate inside. They're powered by light, so long as you've got UV light, they simply sit there under natural light and they rotate. As you can see here, you can pick them up and they float around inside the ball. It's quite mesmerizing. There we go. And of course you can get a variety of different stands. So you've got a whole bunch of different designs. You've got planets, you've got all sorts of funky modern designs. So if you want to buy this for a present for someone for Christmas or whatever, then this is absolutely awesome. There's a load of choice there. There's different sizes, different designs, and also different stands that you can put them on as well. And you know, honestly, the educational value of these is amazing as well. Being able to see a globe in your hand, pick it up whenever you like, is a really good way of reminding you where all the countries are, which is very useful for a channel like this when we're talking about weapons and cultures from all over the world. Everyone in my family loves our Moviglobe and all of our guests want to come in and pick it up. They always want to ask about it, they want to ask how it works, and kids love it as well, and it gets them interested in geography. So my special offer for you today is that if you go to moviglobes.com or click on the link below, using the discount code SCHOLAR, you can get 10% off the 6 or the 8-inch globes. And there's a whole bunch of variety there, there's all sorts of options, and thanks once again to Moviglobes for sponsoring this channel and this video. Okay, so thanks for sticking with me. Now let's get back to this. So this is the Type 1 energy weapon or sword, one of the Covenant weapons apparently. I have played Halo a long time ago, but I am not at all up to date with it. And it's used by the Sangheili, who are a type of aliens that have very specific hands. Now, if I just put down this Arkansas toothpick for a second, they have 2 fingers and 2 thumbs. That means they have a particular way of gripping weapons. And this, of course, when I've talked about fantasy weapons in the past, we shouldn't just redesign weapons that exist in our world, because you have to consider if creatures are bigger, tougher, stronger, if they breathe differently, if they exist in different environments, or indeed if their hands are constructed in different ways, their weapons are going to look and function differently. Even if a weapon looks the same, it might be used very differently. And I think that's the case here. So I've pulled up some data on this. So this is apparently manufactured by the merchants of Quikost. You'll have to excuse my pronunciations of this. And it is the model Type 1, and it's a type of energy sword. Now, this is a handheld, single-handed, we used in one hand, energy sword. Its length is 4.15 feet long, or 1.265 meters. So this is big. However, it's obviously relative to the size of the creatures using it. So we're going to assume here that this is something the size of a large dagger, short sword, or one-handed sword maximum. Okay. Now, obviously, we can't really question the science of the weapon. We'll assume that the plasma shape is possible and that it's an effective weapon. But let's talk about the shape of the hand, the shape of the user, and does that weapon make sense? Well, I think yes it does. It makes an awful lot of sense, and I'm actually really impressed by the game designers in this particular situation. Fundamentally, I think most of you will realise that the real world comparison for this weapon is the Indian Katar, okay, and we're going to come back to the Katar and its variants and related weapons in a second. But before we do, I'm just going to pick up a typical one-handed sword. So clearly the design of a sword as we know it is largely dictated by the fact that we have 4 fingers which go around one direction and 1 thumb which goes around the other direction. And in fact, with a thing like this sabre, the thumb is often placed up the back. That means we have an opening here, which does in fact make you vulnerable to disarms. Maybe we'll talk about disarms more in a future video. But fundamentally, the design of the hilt with the straight rod is dictated by the fact that our hand is the particular shape that it is. Now, the fact that we hold it in this way brings the point in line with the arm here, and this is the conventional way that most swords in our world are created. However, not all of them are. And clearly, if our hand was designed differently, if we only had 2 fingers and 2 thumbs, we would be, in a sense, gripping symmetrically around the weapon. But in addition, if we had different biology and design of our skeletal structure and muscular structure as well, it might be that cutting in the way that we're so good at, because you have to bear in mind our ape ancestors, they use, and relatives, they use sticks. So if you look at gorillas or chimpanzees, they will pick up a tool, a stick. Sometimes they use it for hitting things, sometimes they hold it as an umbrella, but they have a very similar motion here, and they also throw things in the same way as us. So actually, when you're talking about a weapon like a sword here, or if you just hand a stick to someone, the most instinctive way for humans and other primates to hit something is like this. That's why under pressure, under stress, no matter how much you teach people to thrust or do other things, they pretty much do this. But of course, if we're in a fantasy or sci-fi environment, we can't assume that another species is going to behave in the same way. So in this case, if we've got a creature which has 2 fingers and 2 thumbs, and maybe their instinct is to do this type of motion, then something much more like the kata would make a lot more sense. And in fact, even in our world, with everything I've just said about humans and our tendencies, in India, for example, we have forms of punch dagger and swords which are arranged like this as well. An example being the pata or dandapata swords, which have the grip at 90 degrees to the direction of the blade. Now, these are rare in human history. They're not the only punch daggers. We do find punch daggers in European history as well. You even find forms of punch dagger in Africa. So they did exist elsewhere, but India was definitely the country that kind of elevated them to popularity, mass popularity. This was one of the default Indian daggers from, well, certainly from the 15th century onwards, and probably for some time before that as well. So in India, these were hugely more popular and also hugely more developed. They came in many different forms, many different blades, many different grip types, and I have a larger example for you here. Now, many of you who are regular viewers of my channel will know my friend and colleague, Gavin, and Gavin sometimes comes around with weapons from his collection. We talk about those. In fact, you'll know that quite recently from videos we've done. And he has left a weapon with me here, which we're going to be talking about in the future, but it is a form of hooded kata, as they're called. So it has essentially an added guard on the back here. So this is the weapon that I'm going to use in hand now to talk about this particular type of energy sword in Halo. So fundamentally, does the Halo sword make sense? Well, yes, it does, in the same way that a kata makes sense. And yes, you could scale this up. You could make the blade as big as the example in Halo relative to the size of my body. You could make it wider. I do think that certainly if you're coming against other hand weapons, a back of hand guard is advantageous, and that's probably how these were used in parrying and such like. But we should also bear in mind that in our world, there are examples which don't have that hooded guard on. So that, in a sense, maybe not in size, but in design, that's a little bit more like the Halo weapon. So fundamentally, gripping with their design of hands, and if we make certain assumptions or conclusions about their musculature and skeletal structure and inherent sort of urges to maybe strike like this rather than to swing in the same way that we tend to, humans tend to, then indeed the weapons featured in Halo does make sense. And I think it's great. I think it's a great bit of linked together thinking, okay, if their hands are constructed differently, their bodies are constructed differently, what are their weapons going to look like? And I think it's absolutely convincing that they end up with a weapon that looks like the kata. The caveat to that, so I do have one major issue with the Halo energy, Type 1 energy sword. And here's my main issue with it. My main issue is that it is clearly fundamentally, if you look at the shape of it, a thrusting weapon. So a kata can be used to cut, and they were sometimes used to cut in Indian martial arts, but it is clearly predominantly a thrusting weapon, so much so that many of these have reinforced tips to punch through armour, such as chainmail and padded armours, cloth armours. So it's clearly primarily a thrusting weapon, and if you look at the tapered shape of it, that makes sense. It wouldn't be that very broad tapering down to a point shape if it was a cutting weapon. So maybe if they're slashing with it, that is a rather inefficient way to use that kind of weapon. That being said, if we look at the Indian pata sword, that does have a long broadsword blade on it, very often a European imported broadsword blade with the same type of grip, and they are used for slashing. So I wouldn't say that necessarily that form of grip, as featured in Halo, is bad for slashing inherently. We see it done with the pata in Indian martial arts. But if we look at the Indian sword, it is a long broadsword blade with a fair amount of width towards the end. When you have a blade that's shaped like this and broad at the base and tapers down, that fundamentally suggests, it's not always the case, but it suggests it's probably more catered towards thrusting than cutting. But nevertheless, it is big, it is broad, and it is made of plasma energy, so, you know, it can cut through things. The question is, why would you make the base of the blade so wide as featured in Halo? Well, I would say for defensive purposes. Now, one of the nice things about having a broad blade is you'll notice it comes down either side of the hand, which means that other weapons, for example, if you're fighting other people with similar weapons, when they slide down, it is well clear of your arm. If it stayed narrow all the way down, you'd then have to have some kind of guard to protect your hand and arm. So in many senses, this type of broad blade actually provides a good amount of hand protection. We even see that on something like the Afghan knife, the Khyber knife, where it's very broad and therefore you don't need an additional hand guard because you've got the broadness of the blade to hide your hand behind. The final thing that I have an issue with the Halo weapon with is that kind of hollow or opening, shall we say, down the centre. Why have two separate blades? It doesn't make sense. Now, obviously something like this doesn't have two separate blades. That being said, there are kata like this which do have two separate blades. So on one hand, I look at the Halo weapon and I think, why does it have a gap down the middle? Because an opposing blade, if the opponent was using a similar weapon, it could come straight down that gap and chop your hand in half, or chop through my weapon because there's no plasma there. It could come right the way down the middle. Imagine having a lightsaber, which was two forks. Another lightsaber could come down the middle and chop it in half. So that does raise some questions. But that being said, maybe we could, think up a plausible reason for why that might be there. So one of the reasons with katas that have two blades is because it fundamentally means that when you stab someone, instead of making one hole, you're making two holes, which clearly does a lot more damage. It's like being stabbed twice in one punch. So that's one thing. It could be for some reason you want to make two holes into an enemy rather than one. So it's kind of possible that having these 2 points, as well as potentially causing 2 wounds rather than one when thrust into a target, potentially because they're kind of narrower blades, perhaps it's some type of anti-armor or anti-carapace kind of optimization. I don't know. I mean, that's a possible idea. There is some other information that comes to light when I read about these in the sort of fandom websites that are available online. And this does give me another idea, and that is that this kind of gap down the centre of the blades could potentially be for trapping, locking, disarming, so in other words, catching an opponent's blade. Now, of course, we do see things like serrations and notches and kind of gaps in blades which are designed to catch and trap other people's weapons in the real world. We see, blade catching left-hand daggers used against rapiers, and there's various other, quillons and other kind of things which are designed to catch an opponent's blade. Now, there is an interesting detail here. It says this is a noble and, well, not this, but the plasma sword from Halo is a noble and ancient weapon wielded by the strongest of the Sangheili, requires great skill and bravery to use, and inspires fear in those who face its elegant plasma blade. And it goes on to talk about how there's developed martial arts and swordsmanship, they describe it as, for using these. Now, in that context, and if we look at Renaissance Europe, I can see some possible explanation for that groove or kind of gap down the blade, that is used for some specific locking, trapping or disarming techniques. So that's just one idea why that might be there, even though on the surface of it, it looks like a stupid design because an opponent's blade could come straight down the middle there and chop your hand in half, or indeed the handle of the weapon. Now, just briefly, while we're on the topic of the handle of that weapon, you will notice that the Halo sword has a fairly round grip. Now, it is shaped, and we have to bear in mind that the Sangeli have got a different type of hand, so they've got 2 fingers, 2 thumbs. So when they grip around it, it's possible that with that type of hand, they don't have the same problems that we would. However, one of the issues, if I just put this one down and pick up the other kata for a second, one of the issues we could face with this type of weapon, if they don't have these bars either side here, you might be wondering why they're there, is that when hitting a target or using the weapon to cut or thrust or bashing against other weapons, whatever, it can twist in the hand. Now, one of the beauties of these rods that come down either side, and one of the reasons that they're there incidentally, is because they brace against the hand and give you that extra friction and enable you to steer the thing and it not get twisted around. My concern with the Halo design is that it could get knocked around in the hand and turn in the hand. But again, their hands and their physiology is a slightly unknown factor to me. So it's possible that that particular kind of grooved shape of the grip, that perhaps it's not cylindrical, for example, it locks into their hand and prevents that happening, and means that with their particular weapon, they don't have the need for these side splints. Now, from a technology point of view, when I was reading about this weapon, I did find out that they are powered by a small battery. I don't know what, lithium? I don't know. One of those CR, what is it, 32s? I don't know what type of battery, but I do like the detail that each time they strike a target, energy is lost from them and they get run down. So we only get a certain number of hits out of them. Now, if we were talking about a martial art or dueling style based on these energy weapons, that would lead to some really interesting consequences. And as a, as a fencer, as a martial artist, I kind of think if we had some rules for fencing whereby we said that each time we hit an opponent, your weapon would lose 10% of its potency, or you would only get 10 hits with it, that would really change the martial art. You'd be far more sparing about potentially, you'd only go for fatal blows that would fight-ending blows. You probably would avoid doing any hits which wouldn't disable the opponent and might lose you energy. And of course, in a melee situation with multiple opponents, or in a battle situation, you might leave that weapon until you really needed it because you wouldn't want to run out of energy. So purely to say that, from a kind of lore or kind of world building point of view, I think this is actually a really interesting point. And it would have huge ramifications, because obviously a bladed weapon, one of the great things, when people are talking about blades versus guns, or even blades versus arrows, is ammunition runs out. A blade doesn't run out until it gets broken or you get out of breath, basically. Or tired out, but fundamentally the weapon, the blade itself, doesn't run out. But these literally do. It's like a firearm or like a bow or a crossbow. Literally, it will run out of hits. One of the other kind of world-building features of this energy sword that I really love is that the Sangeli have essentially a bit like the gripping mechanism trigger built into a Colt 1911 pistol. It is built in so that only they can use it, and if they drop it, if it gets lost, someone else can't pick up and use it. I think the weapon destroys itself, and I really like that as a world-building kind of lore, as a thing. It kind of introduces interesting story building things, and it makes a degree of sense. And there's some parallels there with the Roman pilum and the idea that the weapon kind of is self-destructible when you throw it at the enemy and they can't throw it back. It's a little bit like that idea. So we do have historical counterparts for that idea, even if most hand weapons don't have anything like this. I like the idea of it. And finally, I really like the idea that the Sangeli treat this as a sort of noble weapon. It is a bit like the Bat'leth in Star Trek. It's something which is associated with the kind of knightly warrior class, and it has a whole culture built around it, even relating to the right to marry and all this kind of stuff. And I like that they've built that into the world building of Halo. So actually, I quite like this weapon. There are certain, I'm not saying that I would design it this way. I wouldn't have that gap down the middle of the blade. I think that's a bit stupid. I think that the grip could be better designed, because you need to think about what stops it turning in the hand. It's not perfect, I'm not arguing that, but I quite like it as a fantasy weapon. It looks pretty cool, and we've got to bear in mind as well that when we're dealing with an alien species with different hands and different bodies and size and strength to us, the weapons are going to look different, so they should look different. They shouldn't just replicate something from the human known world. So finally, how do I think this weapon should be used? I think it should be primarily essentially a punching, a stabbing weapon. Yes, there might be some cuts, but they would mostly be defensive motions. So if someone's stabbing at you, you might have these types of lateral motions which are parries and rebats in order to open up for the thrust. But from what I can see of the weapon and what I know about it, it should be primarily a stabbing and thrusting weapon, and defences should primarily probably be done with probably the flat of the blade most of the time in a slapping aside motion. So essentially beats upwards and downwards, parries against other similar blades, followed up by ripostes with stabs. So really, pretty much how a kata was used. Anyway, Galen Lake, thank you so much for sending your email question to me. It's given me a great opportunity to talk about a weapon that I didn't really know anything. I mean, I'd seen them in posters, but I didn't really know anything about them before. So now I know a bit more about Halo. Maybe I'll go and play some Halo tonight. But thanks a lot, Galen, for your message. Again, to any other viewers, if you want me to deal with other fantasy sci-fi weapons, you know, put the suggestions down below or send me an email. Maybe it's something I'll get around to looking at some point. It's pretty interesting, and it enables me to use my knowledge of historical and ethnographic weapons in new and imaginative ways, hopefully. I hope this has been enjoyable to you. I know it's kind of a bit off the beaten track from my channel, but hopefully it's been a fun one for you. I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.